We have a guest in studio who's talking with us about an issue that most people eventually get familiar with, but it does strike them sometimes when they're younger as well. Jeremy Daly is joining us from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. Bill Colley with you as well. It's coming up on 8:34. We're at 24. And if you've got a comment or question, of course, for Jeremy while he's in the studio with us today, feel free to give us a call. It's 736-0300. That's 736-0300. First of all, Jeremy, welcome back.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
We were just talking off air about I had it happened. It surprised me a few years ago. I had two friends. They were both in their early 40s, which we think of today as relatively young,
I'd say so.
and they both ended up telling me that they had been diagnosed with gout, and I hadn't heard the word gout probably since I heard one of my grandmothers talking about it when I was a kid. Uh, I don't know. Is it still a fairly common affliction?
It definitely is common. I mean, we see it I would say on a regular basis, enough to make it a topic of discussion today. Um, Not necessarily just gout, but a few other things that I wanted to discuss, like rheumatoid arthritis and even what's called a infectious arthritis or septic arthritis that we'll talk about later. But yeah, gout's an interesting disease because there's not really any indication that you can tell you're going to have a gout attack or a flare up. And the first time you have it, it's just alarming because you have this bright red swollen joint, just tender to the touch. Most people, the first time they have it, they can't even put their socks on or have the sheets touch it on the bed. So it's pretty debilitating the first time they experience it, and they don't know what to do a lot of times. So they're, do I go to the emergency room? Do I go to my doctor? Where do I go? So it's kind of a scary thing.
A friend of mine, when she came down with it, she referred to something called uric acid, a buildup of that, and said that had been diagnosed as what was responsible for her issue. And she had to work on her feet. I mean, she owned a house cleaning business, and it was very debilitating for a while until she actually found someone to help her out with the treatment. But did she have it right that it's this buildup, this acidic buildup?
Yeah, so it's uric acid is the name of the specific acid, and really what it comes down to is some people they're overproducers and some people are under excretors, meaning they don't get rid of it as well as the other as most people do. So usually we blame the diet. That's the biggest predisposing factor. I mean, if you have somebody who it has maybe under excreting problems where they can't get rid of that uric acid very quickly, and they have a diet that's high in foods that are rich in purines. It's basically a nitrogen-based um, compound that if you eat a lot of it in your diet, then it can actually build up and develop into uric acid and build up in the joints. And for some reason, it seems to settle in the big toe. So
And it could be either foot then, right? Or
yeah,
both.
yeah, it could be both. I mean, I've seen it in a lot of different areas. Sometimes in the wrist or the fingers, sometimes in multiple toes or the ankle, but usually it's in the smaller joints. I don't have any experience with gout building up in the knees or the hips or the shoulders. Usually it's the smaller joints that it builds up in.
Now, are there people out there who don't respond to treatment?
I would say for the most part, I don't have any experience with that when it comes to gout. Most of the time, the treatment is one, let's get rid of the inflammation. So we do things like anti-inflammatories just to help with the pain because it is excruciating, like you mentioned earlier. So we help bring down the swelling. Sometimes we'll do a course of steroids, even if it's really severe. Um, but then we look to other medications. If this is a recurrent thing, some people, like I said, they're just under excretors of uric acid, and so they build it up really easily. So those people, we give them medication to keep that crystalline structure from forming in the joint, that uric acid crystal, and so they'll take daily medications for prevention of the gout. Um, but most of the time we say, well, let's avoid the foods that cause this problem. And it's pretty easy to do for the most part.
I was going to say, uh, once you get the treatment, it probably is fairly rapid too, as far as recovery goes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's usually within a few days. I would say no longer than a week in most cases, unless it's very severe. Um, but, if we can say, well, let's talk about your diet. And we say, well, tell me about your meat consumption, especially red meats and fatty fishes like mackerel and herring. And I don't know too many people that are consuming those on a frequent basis. Sardines, that's a big one. Um, but a lot of the things that we see are the red meats. Red meats are high in purines. Um, Beer is it's high in purines. So it's kind of a barbecue disease where someone has, something to drink over the weekend and they have a big steak with it, and all of a sudden Monday morning they're aching. And that's a really common scenario that I've seen in the clinic.
We wanted to mention we've got a short break coming up, but if you've got a comment or question for Jeremy Daly while he's in the studio with us from Tripp Family Medicine, telephone number following the break, 736-0300. We're going to talk about some other arthritic conditions too as well this morning. It's 8:40. Right now we're at 24. Bill Colley with you as well on Top Story this morning on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com. Jeremy Daly joins us in studio this morning from Tripp Family Medicine right here in Twin Falls, Idaho. Happened to see Jeremy out doing some lunch shopping the other day. He was walking down Fillmore Street. Uh, One of you gets designated, and then you have to do the run for everybody in the office. That's how that works.
Every now and then.
Yes.
I don't get out much, but that was one of the days.
We wanted to point out, of course, if you are looking maybe for a new doctor's office in town, you may be a newcomer, in fact, to the Twin Falls area, Magic Valley, or northern. You got people who drive in from long distance in Nevada, right? They're
We
coming in.
do. We have people all the way from Elko coming in.
Wow, that's a long trip.
Yeah, that's crazy.
Well, the roads have not all washed out, so they can still get here. But for people who'd like to know more about the office, what would you tell them? I mean, there's a lot of contact information.
Yeah, there is. You can get a hold of us just by calling us, and I think that's the best way. You can talk to a person at 933-4400. Come see us at 1411 Fillmore, just right across from the post office. And, get a hold of us on Facebook or our website, trippfamilymedicine.com. We have a lot of information about the services that we offer, the things that we do, and the events that are going on in the clinic. We always seem to have something going on.
Yeah, yeah. We're talking a bit about joint pain, but really specifically today, things related to various arthritic issues.
hmm
And we had delved into some of these a few weeks ago, but you're looking at, I mean, the numerous causes. Obviously, a lot of it just becomes wear and tear. Sometimes it's disease, and we're trying to narrow that focus a little bit today.
Yeah. So we wanted to talk a little bit about rheumatoid arthritis, which a lot of people don't know or understand what it is completely. People come in all the time and they say, "Well, I know my mom or dad had arthritis, but I'm not sure what kind of arthritis it is." Well, a couple of weeks ago we mentioned osteoarthritis, and osteo is
Hmm.
the word for bone. So it's bone-on-bone arthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis that we wanted to talk about today is it's actually an autoimmune disease. Autoimmune diseases are interesting because it's the body attacking itself. For whatever reason, some people think because of exposure to viruses, sometimes there's some sort of genetic component to it, but we develop these antibodies that actually attack ourselves. So we see things like the thyroid be destroyed that way. We see joints be degraded because of this. Um, there's all sorts of diseases like lupus, where entire organ systems are completely destroyed by these autoimmune antibodies. But specifically the joint stuff, we're talking about rheumatoid arthritis. There's a lot of different variations of that, and we don't want to go into that today. Um, but it's, well, what do you look for if it is rheumatoid arthritis versus like the bone on bone that we talked about a few weeks ago? Well, the big thing is, when you have bone on bone arthritis, most of the time the joints that are enlarged are really hard. The bone is grown and overgrown again. But when it's rheumatoid arthritis, a lot of times the joints feel, we describe it as boggy. It's squishy. You can press on the joint, it's compressible, full of fluid. And so that's one of the hallmark features of rheumatoid arthritis. And so if people are seeing that, where, oh, my joints feel kind of squishy right there, or, we see some deformity that actually happens. One of the big features of rheumatoid arthritis is actually, it's called ulnar deviation, where we see fingers bend towards the pinky, you could say. Um, the ulna is the bone of the forearm that's underneath. Um, and so it's kind of deviating that way, and that's another feature that we see quite a bit. And the disease is tough to manage because it's autoimmune. So we're really focusing on how do we suppress our own immune system, keep it from attacking itself.
So the treatment is obviously a little bit more complex than it would be for something like gout, which can be remedied quite quickly.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a progressive disease. When you're looking at rheumatoid arthritis, it's something that over a lifetime you're really just trying to keep it at bay. There's not necessarily a cure for it. There's so many medications, especially now that are amazing medications. The side effect profile comparatively, to what we had 30 years ago is really low, and people feel sometimes complete remission of disease because of these medications. And so there's a lot of hope for these people. And that's why I wanted to mention it is, sometimes people they don't know what they have as far as this joint pain. And so if they come in, they're evaluated for it. If it is the bone on bone, we can manage it conservatively and hopefully slow down the progression. But something like this, sometimes we can turn things around for people and improve their whole quality of life.
And there's another issue here too, is that when this is going on, it is literally I don't know, eating away is the wrong word to use there, but
I think
it
that's a
is
good descriptor.
it is destroying various joints that people have.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you look at the X-rays of some of these rheumatoid arthritises, and they're really just destroying the bone at the joint most of the time. So sometimes there's no real joint to speak of. I mean, if you look at a normal X-ray, you'd say, well, that doesn't even look like it's right. I mean, there's no definitive end or beginning of the next bone in a joint. So it can be very bad, especially in the hands and smaller
And
joints.
and there's apparently a genetic component to this. It can be inherited.
Some people, it seems like some people are more prone to developing rheumatoid disease. And, you know, as far as like genetic mutation happens, some people they have a, a gene, when we look at gene expression, some people have a trait, um, and some people have basically the forms that don't show up so often, um, or some people have an actual gene that's expressed really easily. And so sometimes it takes a while. If you have one bad gene, it takes a while for things to happen in order for that other gene to be mutated or changed so that the disease actually expresses itself.
When we think about arthritis, we tend to think about it as being an old person's disease, but with rheumatoid, that's not always the case.
Certainly not. I mean, you see kids with rheumatoid arthritis. There's a lot of rheumatic disease in children. Um, so, if you see swelling in your kids' joints, knees. So, a lot of times in kids, it will be bigger joints like knees and elbows. But if you see things like that, that's not normal. That needs to be evaluated. Um, but we see it in young kids. I mean, teenagers and early 20s. I mean, there's really not any age group that we don't see it in, I guess you could say.
Are there markers that in advance that because you mentioned teenagers, I'm sure that you don't see it a lot in 8-year-olds, but probably by the time kids get into their they pass puberty, you might start to see it develop. But are there is there an ability to maybe to diagnose it in advance to see it, blood work or something that might be available to help you say this is going to happen and we better start working on it now?
Yeah, there are things that we can check, but like we talked about earlier, some people will have certain markers in their blood or they have genetic predispositions that may never come to pass. And so we can always screen for different diseases, um, but doesn't mean that's going to happen. So do we screen for it and give someone a lifetime of worry and concern? Or do we say if you develop any of these symptoms, come in? It's a tough thing because some people they know and they say, well, okay, I'll be very cognizant of what's going on, and some people they don't want to know because they always feel like I'm going to develop this disease. I mean, it affects their perception about their health, even if they're very healthy people. Sometimes they feel like I could develop disease, or I'm prone to developing this disease.
And there's also some concern too, and I know that medicine today is very tightly regulated. That trying to treat someone perhaps who may show a marker but never actually develop it, those are resources that would be probably used elsewhere, better used elsewhere.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, a lot of times we're not going to treat. We treat based on symptoms. The blood work sometimes will show different markers. Like I said, like rheumatoid factor can be actually elevated in people who don't have rheumatoid disease. There's something called ANA, anti-nuclear antibody, that we check, and that's elevated quite a bit, but it doesn't mean that there's disease going on. There's all sorts of this anti-Smith antibodies and anti-CCP antibodies. So there's so many tests that we can run, but it's really useful if we have clinical symptoms in association with a marker. Otherwise, it's informational, um, but it could be just raising concern that shouldn't be there.
There was a TV story many years ago that I saw about a woman who was having issues with arthritis, and I don't know if it was because of aging issues or rheumatoid, but at the time, one of the at least solutions was they were giving her injections in her joints to just sort of lubricate them a bit and hope that that in itself would reduce the pain and perhaps help at least preserve some of the bone that was rubbing against the other bones.
hmm Yeah, so we do some of those injections as well. So things like it's called visco supplementation, where you basically supplement the joint with this thick, um, it's joint lubricant. Uh, Sometimes people call them rooster comb shots. That's how they were developed initially. But basically it just adds a layer of protection, and they usually last about 6 months, those injections do. And it's for the bone on bone arthritis. But most of the time we don't do for like rheumatoid arthritis is we don't do any kind of injection to the joint. Sometimes the medications are injectable themselves. Um, but
I would imagine sometimes too, it's just trying to work with people on pain management. If they have a rheumatoid issue, especially, and uh, so that they can still go on living even though they're going to have a pretty serious issue.
sure, yeah, quality of life is really what we're trying to preserve there. And that's one thing that we usually defer to specialty care for, pain management, just because it's a complex issue for a lot of people. And if you're going to be on pain management, usually it's um, a long-term solution, so to speak. And so we usually refer to one of the pain management clinics here in town. Um, but yeah, it's a tough thing. I mean, to live in pain and have constant pain, it affects everything, your perception of your health. Uh, a lot of people in chronic pain deal with things like depression and anxiety, and it's a tough thing.
We think too about the modern world. So many of us work with a keyboard, whether somebody running a checkout machine or somebody working in an office. Just it has become we're all writing up reports constantly. So just sometimes working with one of these becomes, I would imagine, very difficult. And if you can't any longer apply those fingers to that keyboard, and you don't really know anything else to do with your life, this is, I don't know if it leads to disability or not, but it obviously it's a challenge for a great many people.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, luckily there's a lot of assistive technologies nowadays, as far as speech assistive technologies and things that will actually dictate for you, which is a pretty amazing thing. And most of them are accurate compared to what they used to be. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people that they can't do what they've been trained to do. I mean, if you're a carpenter and you develop disease like this, it's tough to build a house, or it's tough to build furniture if you can't do those things with your hands. So there are some people that end up in bad situations as far as their jobs go, and being able to provide an income for themselves.
Right, voice assisted technology would help you typing because that's one thing, but swinging a hammer, there aren't a lot of other alternatives.
Certainly not. Certainly not. No.
I was going to say I recently got one of those fire sticks at home, and if I have it on sometimes, and you've got to actually press a button to get it to respond, but I've seen how this technology can work, at least in that sense. I also have a new phone, and sometimes without realizing it, I'll say something in the house, and all of a sudden the voice will say, "I did not understand you." It comes out of nowhere. It throws you a little bit. For people again who'd like to know a little bit more about your office, we've got about a minute to go or so. Uh, Fillmore Street, the north side of the city, across from the main post office. But we need to stress again, in family medicine, this is not assembly line medicine. So anyone who might be suffering from what we've talked about today is going to get some very personal care.
Definitely, we really pride ourselves on the experience that our patients have in our clinic from the front line. Um, our ladies that work in the front of the clinic, they're great. They make people feel welcome. Our nurses are very attentive, and we have a great system worked out where we pass things off to each other, but the nurses stay with us the entire visit, which is great because communication isn't lost in a passing a baton, so to speak. And so we're able to, I think, give really good care to patients. And sometimes we can't spend as much time as we want to, but we do our best to spend time with our patients. Um, there's a lot of limitations of what we can do, um, but we always make sure that we have enough time for new patients, and our existing patients I think always feel like they get our attention and time, and we resolve the things that they need or work on the things that they need as best we can.
I mentioned that voice that responds on my phone, and this happens just out of nowhere sometimes. It's a female voice. It's a recorded female voice that says that she doesn't understand me, and I thought, story of my life. Well,
Exactly.
thank Jeremy Daly for coming by today from
Thanks,
Tripp
Bill.
Family Medicine. Coming up on 9 o'clock news in just a moment from Fox News. Also going to be talking to an organization in the next hour of the program. Spend a few minutes talking about an upcoming event and calling all patriots, if you will, and we're not talking football. That's on the way on Top Story this morning with Bill Colley on News Radio 1310 KLIX and newsradio1310.com.